So my name's Dave Meyer. I head up the transportation markets group at 3 Degrees. And I will start with a little bit of an intro into 3 Degrees, who we are, what we do kind of generally, and then spend a few minutes talking about the clean fuel regulations. I'll try to leave a decent amount of time at the end for questions. So definitely want this to be interactive and hear what you're interested in, what you want to learn, those kinds of things. So first, 3 Degrees, who are we? Our mission is to help companies and their customers take urgent action on climate change. Looks like we got a little bit of an issue with um, with the advancing here, but hopefully that gets cleared up. So everything that we do is really oriented around that lens, right? Helping to make an impact on climate change. To that end, uh, there we go. We have solutions that cover the breadth of emissions that a company might have. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I think 3 Degrees is probably most well known for being an environmental commodities firm. So a lot of the work that we do is around renewable energy certificates, carbon credits. Obviously, we'll talk about clean CFR credits and similar kinds of incentives. But we also do consulting on other opportunities to reduce those scopes of emissions, including power purchase agreements and other approaches. Recently, on the scope 3 side, talking a lot about value chain interventions, or what some folks are calling insetting, right? Making reductions in your supply chain to reduce your overall footprint. Um, in the transportation space in particular, 3 Degrees has been active in this area for a long time. We actually generated some of the first credits that were issued under AB 32, which is kind of the mother regulation that birthed things like the low carbon fuel standard in California. And a large focus of the work that we do in that space is in clean fuel standard markets. So things like California's LCFS, the Canadian CFR. At this point, we've generated over 200,000 CFS credits to date for our partners. And we have over 30,000 pieces of individual fueling equipment registered. And that covers kind of the breadth of applications that you can think of that are eligible under these programs. So we have a long track record here and extensive experience in this space. So I think that's enough about 3 Degrees. So let's turn a little bit to the clean fuel regulations and kind of trying to understand how that program works and what the value is for EVs and charger owners. I do want to say that because this is an EV and charging conference, I'm going to focus pretty heavily on that EV side of things. There are a lot of other things that this program covers, but we're not going to get into that today because probably not as interesting to you all. But if you have questions on other things, hydrogen, other renewable fuels, things like that, happy to talk about those afterwards. So feel free to come find me. So at a high level, right, what is the CFR? The clean fuel regulations really represent an attempt by the Canadian government to reduce emissions from the transportation space. The way that this works is they focus on what's known as carbon intensity, which is essentially the emissions per unit energy expended in the transportation space. The CFR in particular sets a target of a 15% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030. The regulations came into full effect in July of last year. There was an opportunity to generate credits before that, but the obligations started to accrue in July of 2023. And they set a declining baseline. So every year, basically, the regulation gets more stringent and requires folks to continue to reduce the emissions in the transportation pool. So functionally, how does that work? Um, you can think of this as kind of a two-sided market, and it is useful to think about this as a market, right? It's not a tax, it's not a levy or a rebate or something like that. It is a market that is driven by supply and demand. That means prices are variable. They can fluctuate over time depending on how the market is performing. But at a high level, the way that it works is entities that supply, we'll call them legacy fossil fuels, generate an obligation that they are required to offset with the use of credits. Those credits come from folks who use fuels that have a low carbon intensity, whether that's hydrogen, electricity, renewable diesel, things of that nature. And that's what creates the two sides of that market, right? The entities like the Parklands and the Shells of the world who have these obligations, and then the entities on the other side who have the credits. It's worth noting a couple of things here. One, this is separate from the carbon tax system that exists in Canada, right? There's a separate fuel tax that is assessed under the carbon taxation scheme. This is a separate program from that. So that's why I say it's a market-based incentive. It's not a tax or something like that. The other piece is this is a regulatory compliance program. This is not a voluntary scheme. So the credits that are generated here are not the same as what you might hear as carbon credits, carbon offsets, things like that. These really represent, again, a regulatory compliance obligation and the means to fulfill that. So I just wanted to make sure that that distinction is clear. And one thing in particular that's worth understanding about that is that means that if you generate credits under this program, you can still make claims about emissions reductions, right? You are not selling off your right to make emissions reduction claims by generating credits under this program. That's a common question that we get and something I think is worth clarifying. So who can generate credits under this program? Again, I'm going to be very focused here on the EV side of things. And there's really two kinds of groups that the regulation contemplates when it comes to EVs. The first is what they call charging network operators. So this is any group that is making chargers available for public use or that is making chargers available for use in a residential setting. Um, in that case, the entity that's eligible to generate the credits is the entity that owns the data that comes from the charger. So when we're talking about the charging network operator, it's really the data that we're focused on that helps define who the credit generator is. One restriction that exists for this group is that 100% of the credit proceeds have to be reinvested into expanding charging networks and or reducing the cost of owning and operating an EV. This is a little bit of a departure from folks who might be familiar with programs like California's LCFS. In those programs, there is an ability to carve out some portion of value for administrative expenses that is not allowed under the CFR. 100% has to go back into these categories. You can't claim any administrative expenses associated with that work. The other group that's eligible to generate credits here is charging site hosts. And the regulation's kind of interesting. The way they define a charging site host is basically anyone who is not a charging network operator. In practice, what that means is if you have a fleet of vehicles that you're operating, if you have chargers at your corporate headquarters, something like that, you're going to be a charging site host. And there, the credit generation is basically whoever has the right to have the charger installed. It's a little bit of a nebulous term, but basically, if you own the charger or you lease the charger and you make it available on your premises for use, that's who's going to generate the credits in that scenario. Also worth noting, charging site hosts do not have the same credit spend requirements as charging network operators. So the next question that we obviously get is, okay, well, how much money is potentially available here under the program? And the short answer is, it depends. But we've presented a few different scenarios here, or classes of vehicles, and the potential value associated with those. It's worth noting that credit generation under the CFR for EVs um, depends on the province in which you charge the vehicles, because the carbon intensity of the fuel, in this case being electricity, depends on the province that you're in. So for these calculations, we kind of averaged it across British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, partly because that's where the large population centers are, partly because the grids are pretty clean in those provinces. So if you're in one of the other provinces or territories, your credit value may be a bit lower than this, just because you're not going to generate as many credits because the grid is not as clean. But this is a rough sense of the value of a few different vehicle applications. We're assuming here a $200 credit price. Right now, I think the market's in like the 200 to 220 range. So it's a pretty rough representation of the value that you could get here. In terms of how credits are actually generated, how value is actually generated under this program. So for EVs, at least, credit generation is an annual process. There are different categories of fuels where you can generate credits on a quarterly basis, but for EVs, this happens on an annual basis. So activity is happening, right? You're charging your vehicles, you're collecting data on all of that. And then once the year ends, then we kick over into the reporting cycle. Now, one thing to call out here on the activity side is crediting can only begin the day after you register in the program. So time does actually kind of matter here. If you have chargers or vehicles that are actively charging now and you're not registered, you are not able to go back and claim those credits retroactively. So you really want to try and get set up sooner than later, so that you can start generating those credits as soon as possible. Once the year ends, all of the data is collected, it's aggregated, and it's verified. I think that's an important call out. The data has to be verified actually before it's even submitted to the regulator. The regulator in this case being Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC. So by April 30th of every year, the data has to be collected and verified and submitted to the regulator in order to generate credits. Credits are then generated after the reports are submitted. We would then sell the credits, the resulting credits, into the market, and then remit payment based on the value of the credits that are earned. So the way that we work under this program and similar kinds of programs, right? Step one is we want to identify all of the eligible activities under the program, make sure that we're capturing all of those. Will help you understand the potential value from those, and then make sure everything gets registered. We have a project operations team that collects the data, reviews it, QCs it, make sure that we're packaging it up in the way that the verifier and the regulator want to see, make sure that we're submitting things on time, all of those kinds of things. Um, and then we can aggregate and monetize the credits. And a couple of notes here. One, and credit buyers in this space like to buy lots of credits at once, right? They don't want to buy 5 credits here or 10 credits there. They want to buy 5,000 credits here, 10,000 credits there. So one of the values here is actually aggregating those credits into lots that people want to buy. The other thing is we have a few different business models that we operate under, and we can help reduce the risk of participating in these markets. So I mentioned market prices can fluctuate. We can offer fixed pricing, upfront pricing, things like that, to make sure that you're locking in a known value for participating in these programs. One thing I also meant to mention on the previous slide when looking at the value of participating in the different markets, we're talking today about the federal clean fuel regulations. There is also a provincial program in British Columbia, the British Columbia Low Carbon Fuel Standard, BCLCFS. And it is possible for our friends who are present in British Columbia to generate credits under both programs and generate value from both programs. And that's particularly interesting in British Columbia because credit prices in that market are closer to $500 per ton. So very valuable program to participate in. So happy to talk about that for anybody who's participating in market or interested in participating in that market as well. So how do you get signed up under the CFR? Well, I've got a few colleagues with me here today, one being John Summers, and another being Warren Johnson, and also Scott Bazana. Feel free to catch me or one of them after this session and come talk to us about what you're doing, what you're trying to achieve, and we'd be happy to chat with you about how to get set up in the program. So with that, hopefully that gives you a little bit better insight into what the program is, roughly how it works. Obviously, there are a lot of details that we don't have time to get into in a short 20-minute presentation, but happy to take any questions that any of you have and go from there. I think there's a mic in the back that they want folks to use.
So going on to that slide with the 2 examples, the was it charge point operators and the site hosts. What would a strata fall under? Like a residential strata that has charging for its residents.
Yeah, so residential charging falls under the charging network operator designation just by definition.
So they would have to reinvest the proceeds from the carbon credits in new chargers.
New chargers or reducing the cost of owning and operating an EV. So that might be like discounting electricity that's dispensed from the chargers. That could be an example of a way to meet that. But yes, any proceeds generated from the program would have to go into one of those 2 categories.
And then what would be some other examples of companies that are operators? So would it be like the on the runs, like that, of the companies that are here? Who falls under the operator firm?
Yeah. So like a charge point, for example, if they're operating a charging network, right? If anybody basically where you can look on an app and say, hey, there's a public charger here that I want to go charge at, they would be considered a charging network operator.
So all the public ones. All right,
That's right.
great. Thanks.
Excellent presentation. Thank you for the presentation. I have a quick question with
Sure.
regards to the credits. Uh, can we utilize those credits to apply against operating costs such as CSMS software fees or maintenance fees to keep uptime of the chargers at fleet level or at public facing charges?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The Possibly. If we were talking about California, for example, the answer is definitely yes. In Canada, I think that's something we'd have to explore with the regulator to confirm. But generally speaking, making sure that more chargers are available is the intent. And so you could, make an argument for those kinds of costs to be included in that bucket, but that's something we'd have to confirm.
I have a question. So, what if a charging host buys hardware from a charging network operator?
Yep.
Who is entitled to the credits?
It really depends on how the charger is used. So if it's meant to be, so let's say you buy a charge point charger, for example. If you deploy that charge point charger in a public setting where it's meant to be used by anybody who can pull up and access it, then it would clearly fall under the charging network operator. If you buy that charger and you say, I'm going to use this to charge my fleet of delivery vans that are operating out of my business, then you would fall into the charging site host. So it's not a question of necessarily who makes the charger. It's a question of how is that charger meant to be used. And so if you're meaning it to be used primarily for private use in a non-residential context, then you would be in the charging site host category, even if you bought the hardware from someone who also operates as a charging network operator. Does that make sense?
It does, but I have a follow up to that. So,
Sure.
as a charging host, let's say we spend the money to put the chargers up, but
Yep.
the fact that we bought it from a network operator, we're not entitled to those credits, correct?
No, you are entitled to those credits. So the charging network operator is only first in line for credit generation, or is only entitled to the credits when it's meant for public use. If you buy the charger from them and make it, so I guess maybe I should have clarified your question. Are you talking about a charger that is meant for public use or a charger that's meant for private use? Sorry, the mic got turned off, I think.
So, let's say we bought chargers for public use.
Then yes, the charging network operator is the one who's entitled to the credits, even if you paid the money to have it installed. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't negotiate a commercial arrangement with them, right, to get some of the credit value, but ultimately they would be the ones who would generate the credits.
You mentioned that the CFR credits are currently sitting around $200 a credit,
Yes.
but it's a market and it fluctuates. Do you see a risk of those credits plummeted with a potential change in government?
So I will admit to not being as well versed in Canadian politics. That said, I think regulatory risk is real in all of these markets. And so yes, we've seen, for example, in the California market, credits at one point were $210. Right now they're $60. That's less a regulatory issue, and actually the program's just been super successful. So that's kind of like one of the weird things about these programs is that the more successful they are, the less valuable they are. So that's certainly a risk. But yes, I would say political regulatory risk is real in all of these programs.
So good segue here. That was kind of what my question was, but I'll build on it a little bit. I'm just wondering what the market drivers are for the pricing. You mentioned success of the program and some regulatory politics. Is there anything else that you see driving prices over the next 10, 15 years? And I'm from British Columbia, so if you have any of the context for BC LCF as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, so generally speaking, right, again, it's a supply and demand question. So um, it's really how big is the obligation versus how big is the supply of credits. Um, what we've seen in the US programs is renewable diesel in particular has come online super strong and is basically flooding those markets. Um, Not clear whether that's going to be as big an issue in Canada, right? In the US, there's additional sources of value beyond the CFS programs, right? Things like the federal RFS, biodiesel tax credit, blender tax credits, things like that. So not clear that we're going to see a flood of renewable diesel coming up here. But that is something to be aware of in these programs. Again, even though this conference is very EV focused, this applies to all fuels in the transportation space, right? So as RNG or renewable diesel or things like that come into the transportation space, that has the ability to impact pricing. In BC, it's kind of interesting actually. For a long time, credit prices, they just changed it so that the cap on the market is above where credit prices currently are. But for a long time, credit prices were actually above the cap in the market. And the only explanation that we have for that is basically companies didn't want to be seen as being out of compliance, right? So you could pay a penalty of say $200 Canadian and come into compliance, but they didn't want to be seen as, being out of compliance. So they were still willing to pay $400 for the credits to be seen as being in compliance. Now I believe the cap's been raised to like $600. So it's well above where market prices are, but yeah, still a very valuable market.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm very loud. I guess I have a question comparing the LCFS in BC and the national, like the CFR. Are there key differences in like credit generation or, does that, I'd be curious to hear what those differences are and if there's maybe one preferred way versus others, particularly because you can stack them in BC, but yeah, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, there definitely are some pretty significant differences. Generally speaking, when it comes to EVs, the categorization under the CFR is pretty loose. It's, if your vehicle weighs below this, then you get categorized this way. If it weighs above that, then you get categorized that way. And if you're marine, then you get categorized a third way. In BC, uh, the the definitions are much more explicit, and the credit generation rate is also different, right? So there's a concept in these programs called the energy efficiency ratio, which basically says how efficient is your vehicle compared to the ICE vehicle that it's displacing. And those values are different between the programs. So your credit generation rate varies. The grid carbon intensity score is different, even though the province is the same. They calculate them differently, so the carbon intensity score is different. So there are those kinds of differences between the programs.
In terms of the fuel switching piece, like when you're using electricity, like the credit generation piece you were talking about, is that different in any way between the LCFS and CFR? The people who receive the credit different in BC versus the CFR?
Yes, great question. Yes, in British Columbia, the credit accrues to whoever pays for the electricity that's dispensed by the charger.
Thank you.
And I think with that, I just hit 0 on the clock. So thank you everybody for taking the time again out of your conference schedule to come listen. And if you have any additional questions, find myself or one of my colleagues, and we'll be happy to chat.